Imagine leaving Venice in the 13th century and disappearing into a world of deserts, mountains, strange kingdoms, Mongol armies, distant cities, and an emperor whose empire stretched across much of Asia. No maps could guarantee the way. No modern roads existed, and beyond the familiar lands of Europe lay a world that most Europeans knew only through rumor. Yet one young Venetian merchant traveled into that unknown world and returned with stories so extraordinary that generations wondered whether he had really seen what he claimed. This is the remarkable journey of Marco Polo. Welcome to SERA History, stories of wars, extraordinary people, lost places, powerful ideas, and the events that shaped the world. In 1271, Marco Polo left Venice with his father, Niccolò, and his uncle Maffeo. The two older Polos had already traveled deep into Asia years earlier and had established contact with the Mongol world. Their return journey had brought them into the attention of Kublai Khan, the most powerful ruler of the Mongol Empire's eastern territories. Now they were going back, and this time, young Marco was coming with them. The journey was not a simple road across a map. The Polos traveled through the eastern Mediterranean and across the enormous territories of Asia, following routes connected to what history would later call the Silk Road. They crossed regions of Persia, passed through harsh landscapes, and approached the vast territories controlled by the Mongols. For Marco, the world was becoming larger with every mile. There were deserts where travelers could become separated from their caravans. There were mountain passes surrounded by enormous peaks. There were cities filled with merchants speaking languages Marco had never heard. And there were cultures, religions, customs, and technologies completely unfamiliar to medieval Europe. Eventually, after years of travel, the Polos reached the territory of Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan was not simply a regional ruler. He was the grandson of Genghis Khan and ruler of the Yuan dynasty in China. His court was one of the most powerful centers of the medieval world. Marco entered a civilization whose cities, wealth, administration, and scale astonished him. The city he described as Kambaluk was Kanbalik, the great Mongol capital, at what is now Beijing. And at the center of this extraordinary world stood Kublai Khan. According to Marco's account, the young Venetian gained the ruler's confidence and spent many years traveling through territories under Mongol control. Whether every detail of his stories was exactly as he remembered it is another question. His book contains exaggerations, strange creatures, enormous numbers, and stories that historians continue to examine. But much of his geographical knowledge was remarkably detailed. He described cities, rivers, deserts, markets, political systems, religions, and customs across Asia. He wrote about the enormous wealth of China. He described silk production, paper money, coal, vast cities, and an organized imperial administration. To medieval Europeans, many of these descriptions sounded almost impossible. China appeared to Marco as a world of astonishing scale. One city especially captured his imagination, Hangzhou. He described it as immensely wealthy, filled with canals, bridges, merchants, ships, and enormous populations. Some of his numbers were almost certainly exaggerated, but the underlying picture was important. Europe was beginning to hear about Asian cities that were far larger and more sophisticated than many Europeans had imagined. Marco's journey also took him far beyond the imperial court. His stories carried him across different parts of the Mongol realm, exposing him to peoples and landscapes stretching from China toward the Indian Ocean. He described the deserts of Central Asia, the mountains of Afghanistan, the riches of India, and the islands of Southeast Asia. Some accounts were accurate, others were distorted by rumor, translation, memory, or medieval storytelling. Yet the scale of the journey remained extraordinary. For almost 2 decades, Marco was associated with the world of Kublai Khan. Then came the journey home. Around 1291 or 1292, the Polos left China by sea as part of a mission connected with the Mongol court. Their route passed through Southeast Asia and across the Indian Ocean. They reached regions including Sumatra, Sri Lanka, and India before continuing toward Persia and eventually Europe. The return journey was dangerous. Storms, unfamiliar waters, disease, distance, and uncertain navigation made long-distance sea travel incredibly hazardous. After years of wandering across the world, Marco Polo finally returned to Venice in 1295. The city he had left as a young traveler was now seeing a very different man. He had spent roughly 24 years away from home, but his greatest adventure was still waiting. Not long afterward, Marco became involved in the conflict between Venice and Genoa. He was captured and imprisoned inside a Genoese prison. According to the traditional account, Marco met a writer named Rustichello de Pisa. Marco began telling his stories. Rustichello wrote them down. The result became known as the Travels of Marco Polo, also called the Description of the World. The book spread throughout Europe, and suddenly, Europeans could read descriptions of a vast Asian world that had previously been distant and mysterious. But the book also created a controversy that has lasted for centuries. Was Marco Polo telling the truth? Some readers believed his stories were impossible. Others accused him of exaggeration. Historians have questioned why he failed to mention certain famous Chinese customs, and why some of his numbers appear wildly inflated. Yet his descriptions of geography and Asian societies contain enough accurate information to make the idea of a completely fabricated journey difficult to sustain. Whatever the truth behind every individual story, the impact of Marco Polo was undeniable. His account helped expand European knowledge of Asia. His descriptions of China, Central Asia, India, and the lands of the Mongols fascinated generations of readers. Centuries later, Christopher Columbus owned a copy of Marco Polo's book. The Venetian traveler's descriptions of distant Asian riches helped fuel Europe's fascination with reaching the East by sea. Marco Polo did not simply travel across a continent. He carried memories of one civilization into another. He connected medieval Venice with the immense world of the Mongol Empire, and his journey became one of the most famous travel stories in human history. Perhaps the most remarkable part is that Marco Polo began his journey when the world was still largely unknown to Europeans. There were no airplanes, no satellites, no reliable global maps, no instant communication, only caravans, ships, horses, mountain passes, desert tracks, and the determination to keep moving. For nearly a quarter of a century, Marco Polo crossed a world that most people in Venice could barely imagine. When he finally returned, he brought something more valuable than treasure. He brought a story of distant empires, a story of enormous cities, a story of the Silk Road, a story of Kublai Khan, and a story that would survive for more than 7 centuries. Marco Polo's journey remains surrounded by mystery, exaggeration, and debate, but perhaps that is exactly why it has endured. Because somewhere between the facts and the legends lies the extraordinary reality of a Venetian who ventured farther into medieval Asia than most Europeans of his age could ever have imagined. And when his journey ended, the world knew a little more about itself. This is SERA History. If stories of remarkable people, forgotten places, powerful empires, wars, ideas, and extraordinary moments from history belong here, subscribe to SERA History, like the video, and leave a comment with a historical journey that should be explored next. Until the next story, history continues.